nature of this seminar. So, you know, hopefully this will yield some insight and some potential questions. So yes, I've left this fairly open and said this is to do with some problems and perspectives. So if we start and, you know, just ask ourselves, you know, how do we actually demarcate a specifically conservative conception of liberty? You might think to start with, well, actually, isn't that relatively straightforward? If we look at what liberals think and, you know, look for the paradigmatic liberal thinker John Stuart Mill on liberty, really the argument for liberty for liberals is either that it's good for itself or it's good for social improvement. And Mill argues for both of those positions, excuse me, within On Liberty. It says the only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way. And he also says the only unfailing and permanent source of improvement is liberty. In other words, that by removing restrictions, society will progress. Likewise, if we turn to socialism, we might say that socialists tend to value freedom for its contributions to either community or equality. And I've picked out two socialist thinkers who make those sorts of claim. Apologies for the slightly wordy quotation from R.H. Tawney's celebrated book Equality in 1931, but broadly this is to do with community. In conditions which impose cooperative rather than merely individual effort, liberty is in fact equality in action, in the sense not that all men perform identical functions or wield the same degree of power, but that all men are equally protected against the abuse of power and equally entitled that power shall be used not for personal ends, but for the general advantage. In other words, that liberty is linked there fairly directly to some form of community cooperative effort. And likewise, more pithily, Roy Hattersley, a relatively intellectual Labour Party politician of the 80s and 90s, a follower of Tony Crossland, wrote a book called Choose Freedom in 1987, where you get this fairly blunt statement. What we stand for is freedom. That is the ultimate objective of socialism. The purpose of the equality which we seek is the extension of liberty. So in other words, that liberty and equality are yoked pretty firmly together. So in other words, it looks like liberty for liberals means either something to do with liberty for individuals themselves or for social progress. And for socialists, it's something to do with linking to community on some definition or to equality. And, you know, you might think, well, by contrast, a conservative will value freedom only in the context of certain kinds of constraints, that it's not a sort of unalloyed good in and of itself. So this might be variously linked to a certain view of tradition or religious norms or natural law or perhaps national values. So, you know, does that resolve our problem? Well, I'm going to argue that's fine as far as it goes, but actually that should make us, I think, ask a lot of more difficult questions, not least about what counts and what doesn't count, about what conservatism is, what is its scope and what is its nature. And actually, if you look at this list of possible constraints on liberty, which of these is the most important? And as we'll discover, there is a kind of divergence even in, you know, what about tradition one is valuing and what has happened to it, even if we did as a conservative accept that is the most important constraint on liberty. So I'm now going to go on to kind of sketch out the variety that I think that we face I think that we face, and really I think I could have talked more, but I'm going to talk particularly about tradition, about natural law, and about conservatives' divisions over pluralism. So if we take potentially tradition as one of the things that kind of really constrains liberty, there are, well, I mean, there are at least sort of 5 kind of different kinds of conceptions, which I'll run through very quickly. For many conservatives, I think it's fair to say liberty only makes sense, or is even epistemologically possible in some cases, against the background of traditional norms and values and practices. But they differ importantly over how they conceive tradition and how important it is. So one name that we've come across already is Leo Strauss, who has a particular view of tradition, and really it's a lament for the decline of natural right, a kind of threefold descent in modernity, which gets worse and worse. So if Machiavelli and Hobbes reduced the ultimate ends that we sought to what's possible in the real world as opposed to genuine virtue, this was then made worse by Rousseau and Hegel, because although Rousseau thought to some degree he was trying to resuscitate ancient virtue, actually all he did was to intensify this process of kind of making a kind of human conduct subject to individual wills, something that Hegel further historicized. And the inevitable, all but inevitable end of this was Nietzsche and Weber's moral relativism, where by the time we've reached Max Weber, reason really can't help us to choose between different courses of action at all. And you know, Strauss, as we already heard, can be difficult to pin down, but if any kind of solution is possible, perhaps because liberal democracy was formed in the slightly less bad earlier stages of modernity, the resuscitation of ancient virtue, which actually some people have been wanting already in this discussion, would be a very kind of qualified one. So there's one version of tradition kind of qualifying liberty, but there are a number of others. There is Edmund Burke's conception, somebody who's more modernist than Strauss, who tentatively welcomes certain kinds of free market institutions, but with qualifications. And before the French Revolution was a supporter of some of the complaints of the American colonists against the British state. But increasingly, Burke became very clear, particularly in the reflections and after, that what actually kind of enabled liberty to be possible was the handing down by tradition of religious norms, the organic British state, and more generally products of tradition. And there is a depressive kind of twist to all of this, that he thinks that modern norms, and perhaps particularly the modern market, are actually in danger of undermining the chivalric norms on which this edifice now rests. So less depressive than Strauss, but still with a sort of pessimistic kind of lean. Then there is Michael Oakeshott. Oakeshott was, of course, very skeptical about certain tendencies of the Enlightenment, and certainly about the possibility of acting freely without kind of practical knowledge. The most famous essay he wrote in Rationalism in Politics really makes that case, that anybody trying to reduce politics to ideals is onto a loser, because you actually require lots of practical knowledge to do things. But in general, his view of tradition, I think, is a more positive one. He constantly says that individual freedom and pluralism are actually modern achievements. I mean, he favorably cites Kant in at least a couple of essays, and I'm thinking particularly of The Masses in Representative Democracy and his great late work on human conduct. So there, to some degree, there is a conservative conception of tradition, but one that values, I think, the modern kind of pluralism that not all conservatives have liked. Fourth, I've picked out Maurice Cowling's, strident determination that actually religion is necessary as part of our tradition in order for genuine freedom to be possible. I mean, I think Cowling is much more interested in authority than liberty, but if liberty is to be a real thing, it has to be in a framework provided by religion as a public doctrine. And then John Gray. I mean, Gray has been through various kinds of intellectual progresses, but certainly at one point worried that the kind of Faustian bargain that conservatives had made with neoliberalism was desperately sad, because that actually meant that the local knowledge and variation and tradition that conservatives so valued was actually becoming impossible by the sort of flattening out and uniformities that modern market liberalism was creating. So there are various ways, various different ways in which conservatives have thought that tradition could and perhaps should qualify liberty. So that's kind of one area. Then, of course, there's natural law, something over which conservatives have differed. For some conservatives, this is very important, but they differ over what this implies and what form it should take. So we've already met Strauss's version of natural law, and, you know, kind of the importance of trying to resuscitate, insofar as that's possible, ancient virtue and, you know, arrest its decline in modernity since Machiavelli and Hobbes. But that's not the only game in town. There are other kinds of arguments for natural law, and I thought I would pick out one important French post-war thinker, Jacques Maritain. Maritain, I think quite predictably, argues that only Catholicism could guide individual goals properly. So that's the constraint on liberty there. That's the guarantee of true freedom. So what you should do as a human by nature is, you know, revealed to you by Catholic doctrine. But strikingly, he combines that, and it might be partly to do with a kind of post-war context. He argues that democracy is the logical implication of Christianity. Democracy is linked to Christianity, and the democratic impulse has arisen in human history as the moral manifestation of the inspiration of the gospel. It's a very kind of interesting and striking claim. So in other words, there is an attempt there to try and combine an argument for natural law with a kind of particular form of democracy, and that might be something we're interested in pursuing. Conversely, other conservatives are much more skeptical about natural law, and here is Oakeshott again. I mean, I think Oakeshott is pretty skeptical that natural law leads in any one direction, that this actually, you know, kind of provides us with enough of a kind of framework for what we do. And the civil association that he advocates, that to some extent constrains pluralism, but also enables it, well, that's related to the moral norms of society, but any attempt at codifying moral rules as laws is bound to be something that is tremendously difficult, he thinks. They are always, to some degree, abstractions. So it's certainly the case that one can't simply be a legal positivist and expect states to command loyalty if they aren't related to the moral values of their inhabitants. But on the other hand, he thinks that any attempt to codify is fraught with enormous difficulty. So there is there, I think, you know, a kind of creative tension. So the second possible constraint, therefore, for liberty is natural law. But not only do conservatives vary over what brand of it that they might want, but also some of them, you know, kind of wonder if it's actually applicable at all. And that, I suppose, is related to the last thing I want to bring up, which, you know, is a kind of very kind of contemporary problem, which is how much pluralism can one tolerate? How much pluralism is a good thing? And again, Oakeshott here is a pretty kind of strong kind of advocate for pluralism within limits. You know, part of the problem about rationalism was its epistemological mistake about kind of thinking about how we perform certain actions, both, whether these are humdrum ones like cooking or kind of very complicated ones like running a state. But the other thing about rationalism is that it fails to capture the massive diversity of practices and intuitions and different ways of life in society. And it is a fallacy of rationalism that it tries to reduce these things to ideals. And he sees that as a very, I think, quintessential conservative trait. I mean, confusingly, I think, he's wary of the term conservatism, but I think that it absolutely is a very conservative insight. Conversely, of course, within other bits of the conservative tradition, there certainly have been much more strident responses. I mean, there are, kind of without being rude about it, I mean, there are certain blood and soil nationalists of the late 19th century. The 1880s and 1890s saw right-wing parties embrace a lot of anti-Semitism. I picked out simply one quite crude example here, Maurice Barré, who wrote a famous novel called Les Déracinés, which was not only anti-Semitic, but anti-Protestant and particularly anti-cosmopolitan. And that kind of rhetoric about the differences between, the difficulty of being the citizen of the world, being a citizen of nowhere, that kind of anti-pluralism and kind of strident nationalism is something that's still very much there. So within perhaps the conservative family, there is another tension. So I'm conscious here, I mean, I hope it's sort of interesting and not merely maddening to point out the kind of complex and various forms that conservatism, I think, has taken since the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. But that, of course, then kind of leads us to think about, well, how on earth do we reduce this variety, or how do we kind of get this under control in some kind of way to pin down conservatism? And of course, there have been a number of different types of attempt at doing that. One might be tempted into a kind of minimal definition, the famous sort of Huntington conservatism as an ideology definition. That system of ideas employed to justify any established social order, no matter where or when it exists, against any fundamental challenge to its nature or being, no matter from what quarter. But that seems so minimal that it doesn't really kind of help us very much. And, I know there are people that whenever I say this who say, I think Soviet Russia was quite conservative, but I admit that I still find this a kind of difficult claim to swallow. One might also try and say, look, it's a tradition, or perhaps even an invented tradition. So again, picking up a British example, one of the more intellectual British cabinet ministers, Ian Gilmore, likened a conservative to an architectural conservationist who treasures the past but allows for a certain updating or renovation. But the obvious question here is, which parts of tradition should one follow? And, without being, willfully controversial, one might say that Brexit was a bit of an example of that. Should one have gone on with it because it had become so involved in the British polity that one couldn't really get beyond it? Or actually was Brexit something that was, false to our tradition and should be spat out? And somebody I admire, Emily Jones, wrote a book about Edmund Burke, basically kind of arguing that Burke wasn't really a conservative and this was codified much later. I mean, I won't comment on, the merits of that case, but I'm not sure that it really tells us what conservatives should now do, or where they would now go now. So I'm going to kind of argue very quickly for advocating Michael Frieden's approach to ideologies. And I'm aware that kind of calling this a conservatism as an ideology is going to be a little bit controversial. Frieden thinks that ideologies are best seen as sort of sophisticated families ideas. So, they have a number of core concepts, but also adjacent and peripheral one, and the latter may vary. So liberty is always core to liberalism, but the qualificatory concepts like society become increasingly more important. Perhaps other ones become less so. And his way of conceptualizing conservatism is to see that it's a combination of four key ideas: managing change cautiously, and diagnosing all actions as subject to extra-human impulses, whether those God or history or order. So in other words, not pure voluntarism. And he says those are the sort of core ideas of what conservatism is. And these are enriched by another two, that conservative tends to set up alternative concrete concepts to the abstract ideals of progressives. So in other words, stressing the concrete nature of freedom rather embodied in institutions rather than abstract ideals. And that's an insight that goes back as far as Karl Mannheim's conception of conservatism. But these are always kind of adjacent. The key thing is always the real cause, not these kind of alternative concrete things. And lastly, that also that the conservative strategy often means misunderstanding willfully or otherwise progressive core concepts. So equality is opposed as the politics of envy or leveling down, a charge that sometimes is actually quite reasonable and sometimes is not. Okay, so how far is that a solution? Well, I think it's a helpful definition. I'm aware that I'm being perhaps controversial by suggesting that conservatism is modern, but it strikes me that Mannheim's insight that conservatism really appears when tradition is seriously shaken is something that I'm quite attracted to. So conservatism is modern, sophisticated and reactive, but not purely reactive. So with genuine core concepts, even if they're different from liberalism and socialism. But this, of course, is a framework. What it does is to provide a framework to do more sophisticated and detailed historical and ideological work to determine what conservatism actually means in a particular period. And of course, it doesn't also rule out that conservatism might end. But I think it also has the strength that it doesn't kind of maintain that liberalism and conservatism and socialism just sit in separate boxes. I think there is a real danger of doing this because actually there are difficult boundaries to be negotiated all the time. I mean, the term libertarianism hasn't been used so far in this discussion, but the question of whether libertarians are conservatives or not is, you know, a kind of classic case of where one might actually need a sophisticated historical or ideological analysis to do this. You know, kind of one kind of place where, you know, this is a very obvious example to pick. Liberals in the mid-19th century argued much more strongly to the conservatives at that point for a small state. By the beginning of the 20th century and arguably later, the reverse is true. So actually kind of looking at where these sort of boundary disputes have arisen between conservatism or libertarianism or liberalism or populism, I think are really kind of important. So just to kind of pile controversy on controversy, I thought I'd look at a particularly kind of topical example, which is where conservatism and populism touch and don't touch. Because there are touching points between these. One might argue that both kind of right-wing populism and conservatism have some kind of affinity with managing change cautiously. Oakeshott famously talks about present laughter over utopian bliss. Is this, you know, something that, you know, kind of finds an echo in populist appeals to the left behind? Conservatives and right-wing populists tend to assert a dominant tradition, a real tradition against the ideology, traditional culture. Nationalism. I referred to Maurice Barrès earlier. I mean, is Maurice Barrès a populist or a conservative, as one of those sort of 19th century anti-Dreyfusards? Often nationalism is weaponized against, you know, kind of immigrants. Is that something that, you know, is now more populist or conservative or both? And how do we police that kind of division? And the other thing, and this has come out in some of the other discussions, that politics might be an inferior activity. You know, conservatives quite often have thought of politics as a bit of an unfortunate necessity, and that maybe finds an echo in populist critiques of corrupt elites. Quintin Hogg, a kind of prominent conservative politician in the post-war and indeed the Thatcher period, I mean, once kind of non-jokingly said that wise conservatives favoured religion, less wise ones liked hunting. But all of that was much better than these ghastly progressives who just were absolutely obsessed with politicking the whole time. And in a sense, that might be a touching point between conservatism and populism. But of course, there are also some differences that might well come out here. Populists are not perhaps inevitably anti-pluralist, but an awful lot of them are. And, talking about the people and the real people as one unified group is something that populists have tended to do quite a lot. The heartland, the real people, in W.G. Sumner's phraseology, the clean, quiet, virtuous domestic citizen who pays his taxes and is never to be heard of. That contrasts, I think, with those people in the conservative family who are much more committed pluralists. And that is certainly quite a strong tradition, shot in conservatism, but also in a number of other sorts of conservatives. So, the degree to which conservatives can be pluralists is, I think, something that needs to be thought about quite seriously. Respect for institutions. I mean, conservatives tend to respect historic institutions quite a lot, not the monarchy, the church, the parliamentary system, in a sort of Burkean way. They tend to be warier of, say, things like referendums. And this, again, it provides interesting classificatory problems. I mean, to take Margaret Thatcher, for example, she was clearly a respecter of some institution, but an eliminator of others, maybe relatively recent ones like the Greater London Council and the Inner London Education Authority. But actually, she did actually get rid of some institutions, and she was quite ruthless about so doing. So, again, here's an interesting boundary dispute. But, broadly speaking, thinking about where conservatives, differ from populists over institutions might well be an interesting area to think about. Certainly, I think for populists, elites are very often corrupt, and it's only outsider figures who disrupt that order that they find laudable. And conservatives in general are often more respectful of traditional elites like that, church, aristocracy, and tradition. At their most cynical, I mean, I'm treating Pareto as a conservative, which I know is controversial, but, in certain kinds of elite theory, there is, a feeling, okay, that elites need to circulate at various points. And that seems to be different to the deep antipathy that populists have of the elite and the establishment. It creeps into certain forms of conservatism, but then is that really populism? And the last thing is that I think that populism are much more relaxed about ideological contradiction. If we're saying that conservatives put forward different positions at different times, and there's a great deal of variety, I mean, traditionally conservatives, when producing, say, manifestos or whatever, tend to, essay something that is genuinely coherent and makes sense. Populists, perhaps because they're ideologically lighter, throw things out, at a rate of knots that just contradict one another. I could have picked more controversial examples, but for example, Donald Trump's recent floating of higher taxes for the rich, which I think went away fairly rapidly, whilst also putting a bill through Congress that in general is pretty good for billionaires, I think is an example of, ideological lightness. So there are sort of four reasons as well why there might be differences between conservatives and populists. So I've gone through a lot of material very quickly, and I hope that has been in some sense useful and not merely bewildering. So here's what I think I'm trying to say. At first sight, it looks simple to distinguish conservatism and conservative liberty from those of progressives. Conservatives believe in something constrained by tradition, natural law, religion, or nationalism, or something like that. But actually, once we probed it, we found that conservatism has this huge variety. there are differences within the ideology over all of these constraints, and indeed what that such a constraint actually means anyway. Now, to some degree, some choices have to be made. So you don't have to take my route, but my route was to pick up Michael Frieden's conception of ideology, which establishes some kind of reason for conservative variety. And the implication of that, I think, is that there are touching points between conservatism and other ideologies, other philosophical positions. And therefore, actually, determining exactly what a conservative conception of liberty, as opposed to, say, a liberal one, will be historically variable, even if not arbitrary, and is not something that can just be picked off the back of an envelope, but requires a lot of detailed historical and ideological work. So that's as far as I've got. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Edmund.